Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. For our main topic today, we'll be talking about WAAS-based GPS approaches and the 7 different kinds of minimums used on these approaches, which every instrument pilot needs to fully understand. Last week in episode 145, we talked about best uses for a flight simulator, either at home or at a flight school. So if you didn't hear it, you may want to check it out. And if you haven't done so already, please click the subscribe button in whatever app you're listening to us now. That helps other people find this show, and it's the only way to get every new episode of Aviation News Talk to automatically download to your phone as soon as it's released. And it's free. So please take a moment and click on that subscribe button now. And speaking of free, this episode is totally free. It doesn't cost you a dime. However, it does take a lot of my time to produce, and I just love it if you join the 3 or 4% of people who listen to the show and who support the show by donating via Patreon or PayPal each month via credit card. After the show, if you've really enjoyed it, go on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And thank you so much for showing your support. This week in the news, pilots and GA companies are fighting the coronavirus, and we'll tell you how. The ACLU is suing a major city that planned to use aircraft to take surveillance photos to aid in solving crimes. And finally, a GA aircraft was used in a recent gold robbery, and we'll tell you which aircraft the robbers favor. All this and more, and the news starts now. Let's start with some of the many stories of GA pilots and companies helping out during the current pandemic. This comes from thestarpress.com. Furloughed pilots work for free to deliver thousands of face shields to Michigan hospitals. 4 single-engine planes arrived at the Delaware County Airport in Muncie, Indiana. The pilots, furloughed commercial airline pilots from Michigan, arrived with smiles on their faces and gloves on their hand. They were part of a small contingent of people, 8 in all, who helped unload a couple of dozen boxes containing 10,000 face shields from a Mercix Corporation van into their respective personal aircraft. One pilot, Nick Hall, said, "When I understood that me coming down here, picking up the mask and bringing them back up there, they'd be in the hospital tonight. Shipping them, they'd be there tomorrow afternoon. If we can get them on the front lines, save a couple nurses, doctors from exposure tonight, that's awesome. That's huge." Hall is a Delta Airlines captain of a 50-seat regional jet. This was his 3rd trip to Muncie to pick up face shields from Mercix, a technology-based manufacturing company based in Yorktown. Josh Fenwick, a commercial pilot in training from Brighton, Michigan, echoed that message. "We have different communities doing whatever they can in different ways," Fenwick said. "We have the medical community who's out on the front lines. By flying them, we greatly reduce the transportation time to get the masks to where they are needed because they're needed now." So far, the pilots have helped deliver more than 20,000 face shields to the Michigan-based hospital chain. Susan Karlick, VP of Business Development at Mercix, said the company has made more than 90,000 face shields since they began prototyping, designing, and producing them the week before. And from the dailymail.co.uk, Carol Vorderman has donated her private plane Mildred to help ferry personal protective equipment to NHS staff, that's National Health Service in the UK, during the coronavirus crisis. Carol, who is a TV personality, shared a selection of images of herself with November 242 Charlie Victor over the years and revealed its current job is helping the NHS. And from looking at that photo, I could see that it's a Diamond DA-40. As well as donating her plane to help with the coronavirus, Carol has also been helping out by launching mathematics classes for children. And from New Zealand, this comes from stuff.co.nz. When Air New Zealand cut flights needed to transport coronavirus samples, labs turned to the flying doctor of Bulls. Dr. Dave Baldwin, who runs the Bulls Medical Center, got the call from an old friend who told him his expertise and Cessna were needed for an emergency run of swabs from Palmerton North to Rangiora, where they'd be driven onto a lab in Christchurch. Air New Zealand had stopped flights between the cities, cutting off a vital route that moved samples of people tested for the virus from parts of the North Island to the lab for testing in Christchurch. He said Air New Zealand canceled at very little notice, leaving MedLab to come up with a way to get the test to the lab as quickly as possible. An Air New Zealand spokesperson said the airline had reduced domestic schedule by 95% due to impact of COVID-19 and the country being at alert level 4. The spokesperson said, "Unfortunately, we are not currently operating to or from Palmerton North." And also from Down Under, this comes from bundabergnow.com. Jabiru Aircraft has created face shields with the help of 3D printing to provide extra protection for frontline workers dealing with the COVID-19 cases. Jabiru, whose business usually focuses on producing light sport aircraft and engines, has responded to the current pandemic by creating face shields utilizing 3D printing technology to provide extra protection to frontline health workers dealing with COVID-19 cases. With these efforts, Jabiru joins other manufacturing entities and individuals around the world in producing emergency PPE, which we all these days now know as personal protective equipment, during a time of global shortage. Now, swinging back here to the United States, this comes from AOPA.org. Aerobridge, the organization that coordinates the use of donated aircraft to provide relief in disasters, has stepped up to provide medical supply logistics support during the coronavirus pandemic, and they're looking for volunteers to register with them. The missions, which Aerobridge believes could become part of a vital link if commercial air traffic comes to a standstill, includes transportation of masks, sanitizer, and other items, according to Aerobridge founder and CEO Marianne Stevenson. Aerobridge has been working to collect supplies in a warehouse in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and they said supplies will be distributed from there as well as from Dallas. I went out to their Facebook page, and they said that the group has dozens of missions this Friday, which would have been April the 10th, commencing about noon to various locales within 400 miles of KFSM, Fort Smith, Arkansas, flying medical PPE. Most of the flights were filled, but at that time they still had 5 yet to fill, and they said they could use standby pilots as well. Anyone interested in registering should go out to aerobridge.org. And from FASANA, that's the Flight School Association of North America, their president has written a letter to the President of the U.S. offering the help of member flight schools. The letter says in part, "Dear Mr. President, the Flight School Association of North America, FASANA, would like to offer the support of our members during this unprecedented time of crisis in the U.S. Our members operate a large fleet of aircraft and have been vetted by DHS. We can in rapid fashion help distribute the special imported life-saving medications which would have an immediate effect on thousands of American families." It offers some other details in the letter and concludes, "Please contact if this proposal is of interest. We're happy to engage and begin immediate execution. Thank you and God bless America." Signed, Robert Rockmaker, President and CEO of FASANA. And from AOPA.org, AOPA's David Toulis has put together a summary of other GA manufacturers who have pivoted to help with the coronavirus relief. And let me just mention a few of those. Textron Aviation is also assisting the fight against the coronavirus by collaborating with Wichita State to manufacture medical face shields from optically clear plastic film. The Kansas aircraft manufacturer, known for its Beechcraft, Cessna, and Hawker GA aircraft, also has plans to make cloth face masks and fabric coverings for healthcare professionals. And let's see, a couple of others here. Apero, an avionics firm known for the Stratus ADS-B traffic and weather receivers, pledged to manufacture 2,000 emergency ventilators for the state of North Dakota by the end of April. And Autodyne, that's the sister company of avionics manufacturer Avidyne, announced that the Massachusetts firm is using its 2 3D printers to crank out face shields and ventilator masks. Autodyne was created to build avionics for unmanned aircraft and is now working around the clock to produce PPE for healthcare workers. And also from AOPA, Tamarack Aerospace Group of Sandpoint, Idaho, which makes active technology load alleviation systems. These are active winglets, and these are made for several Cessna Citations, has joined other aerospace companies in producing PPE to help battle the COVID-19 pandemic. Tamarack started to make masks using its 3D printer around March 26 after learning its local hospital was running low on vital protective gear and finding print files on a website. Quote, "The cool part of these masks is that they can provide multiple uses, as a plastic mask can be sanitized and the filter material can easily be replaced. The little window in the front of the mask simply pops out, the filter is placed in the hole, and the window clamps the filter material in the front of the mask." Jacob Klingensmith, the president of Tamarack, said that a couple of different filter types can be used, and Tamarack selected one that provides an equivalent protection to N95 mask material. The company has made nearly 50 masks for its local hospital, Bonner General Health, in Sandpoint, Idaho. And finally, from the Cirrus Aircraft website at cirrusaircraft.com, over the last few days, our experimental team has assembled 31,500 face shields for the local medical community. These face shields were made possible from materials provided by Frost River Trading and our team's steady work. As a disposable shield, they are a critical need as a simple and effective tool to protect healthcare workers. Of even greater need are powered air purifying respirators, PAPRs. These are battery-powered blowers that provide positive airflow through a filter to a hood that's worn by healthcare workers to protect them from contaminated air. At the moment, these units are in extremely high demand with traditional medical supply options limited. Our team, along with Frost River Trading, quickly got to work prototyping equipment to meet this need, with 850 hood and coupler assemblies to be created in the next week. At the heart of creating full PAPR units is a project to recreate the blower units available at area hospitals, which are in short supply. Our engineers have designed, prototyped, and tested a replacement assembly using CAD software as well as 3D printing. The design our team came up with cost a fraction of the typical 3M units supplied to hospitals. The newly prototyped design will be tested in the coming weeks. If approved, Cirrus is set to provide nearly 200 of these blower assemblies. And finally, from planeandpilot.com, FAA launches coronavirus site. The new website is one-stop info shopping for information about temporary changes to FAA rules during the COVID-19 pandemic. Last week, the FAA rolled out a new coronavirus site that puts all coronavirus-related exemptions and other guidance on one page, where stakeholders can get information on everything from guidance on allowing overflow aircraft to park at their airports to details about the mega bailout CARES Act. That website is faa.gov/coronavirus. And here's just one example that I pulled from the website. It said FAA implements flexible air traffic control schedule. The FAA is taking steps to limit the spread of COVID-19 in ATC facilities. Each ATC facility is establishing separate teams of controllers that will stay together during the duty week. Each crew will contain the same employees, limiting the possibility of cross-exposure to COVID-19 that would come through normal shift rotations. If a person on one team gets sick, the only people who would be exposed are the other people on that team. These steps, along with existing contingency plans, further enhance the resiliency of the FAA's air traffic control system. And now turning to other GA news, listener Roland Delhomme was the first to send me a photo from the city of Monroe, Louisiana's website, telling us that a tornado touched down on Sunday morning at their airport. Here's more of the story from avweb.com. The airport at Monroe, Louisiana took a direct hit from a powerful tornado late Sunday morning. Photos from the airport show flattened hangars and other buildings and aircraft strewn among the wreckage. The damage prompted officials to close the airport until further notice. One photo showed at least 4 business jets damaged or destroyed. Some buildings were toppled by the winds, while the structures of others remained standing, and the siding and insulation was peeled away. It was the third important GA reliever airport to get hit in recent weeks, after Nashville's Tennessee John C. Toon got hammered in early March, and Arkansas's Jonesboro got slammed 2 weeks ago. The tornado was part of a dangerous line of storms sweeping the south that has prompted warnings and watches from Louisiana to Georgia. More than 95 million people are under the warnings, and the storm system is expected to move up the East Coast as far north as Virginia by Monday. Unfortunately, at least 21 people died on Sunday in tornadoes that touched down across the South. And then more news that came out on Monday. In South Carolina, tornadoes slammed the airport in Walterboro, destroying a number of planes and buildings as well as a vintage DC-54 Skymaster. Of course, the bad news for pilots are that losses are certainly north of $100 million to the aircraft themselves, never mind the hangars or other facilities, which will mean increases in insurance premiums. And if I'm counting correctly, I think that's a total of 5 airports that have been hit in the last month or two in the South by tornadoes. From the BaltimoreSun.com, ACLU sues Baltimore police over contract for private planes to survey city for photographic evidence of crime. The American Civil Liberties Union and its Maryland branch are suing the Baltimore Police Department over a controversial plan to fly surveillance planes over the city. The suit challenges the city's surveillance contract, narrowly approved by the city's Board of Estimates, which authorizes a pilot program to collect images of the city over a 6-month period to help investigate murders, non-fatal shootings, armed robberies, and carjackings. Texas philanthropists Laura and John Arnold, through their organization Arnold Ventures, are paying for 3 planes, their pilots, analysts, and hangar space, as well as grants to help researchers study whether the program is having an impact on Baltimore's violent crime rate. The city has had more than 300 homicides annually for the last 5 years. The technology is capable of capturing images of 32 square miles of the city for a minimum of 40 hours a week. In the lawsuit, the ACLU argues that the surveillance system is a threat to the right to privacy and free association under the First and Fourth Amendments of the Constitution. Police Commissioner Michael Harrison, who was publicly skeptical about the plan in the past, advocated last week for the planes, arguing the pilot program is needed to determine whether the technology could help reduce crime. Harrison said data from the planes will be stored for 45 days unless it is needed for an investigation. The planes can't be used for real-time surveillance, only to look back, and no one will be arrested solely based on images produced by the plane, he said. Civil liberties advocates argued visual data from the planes could be coupled with video from the city's network of surveillance cameras on the ground, which are disproportionately located in minority neighborhoods. The planes could have started flying this month according to the contract. And now we have several stories of the weird, all involving aviation. Unless you live in Florida, you probably didn't hear about this story, and if it weren't for the current pandemic, I think it would have been big news on all the networks. From CNN.com, a fire at a Florida airport destroyed more than, get this, 3,500 rental cars. A fire that spread through a grassy area of Southwest Florida International Airport has destroyed thousands of rental cars, fire department officials said. The blaze began Friday, spanned 15 acres, and originally involved only 20 cars in the grassy rental car overflow area at the airport in Fort Myers. But by the time it was extinguished, the flames had destroyed more than 3,500 rental cars. Melinda Avney, mitigation specialist for Florida Forestry Service, said authorities were called to put out the fire around 5 p.m. Friday when there were about 20 vehicles involved. Quote, by the time we had units on the scene, we had 100 cars on fire. We lost count after the hundreds, she said. Black clouds of smoke could be seen for miles around Fort Myers, a city of about 80,000 people in southwest Florida. Ground and aerial support was provided by Florida Forestry Service and multiple fire departments. At least 80 airdrops were made by the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office aviation units. The Forestry Service said the blaze was contained by 10:30 a.m. Saturday, nearly 18 hours after it began. The brush surrounding the overflow caught fire and helped it quickly spread, but no structures at the airport were affected. No injuries were reported, and the cause of the fire is under investigation. And from planeandpilotmag.com, the least expected U.S. pandemic effect? Airport monkeys. Well, monkeys have begun to invade the Fort Lauderdale Airport, that's FLL, making their way onto the ramp and scaling terminal buildings, according to evidence we found online. How did this happen? It's a story we can't believe we haven't heard before. Southeastern Florida coast history enthusiast Bill Sablesack clued us in, and you won't believe how crazy it is. Around 75 years ago, a Tarzan film starring Johnny Weissmuller and actress Maureen O'Sullivan was filmed near Fort Lauderdale. A Tarzan film needs monkeys, so the film's producers imported them, 5 couples in fact. After the filming was over, a local tour guide stranded them on an island just off the coast, not realizing they could swim. Well, they could, and they did all the way to shore. Today, there are more than 1,000 macaques in Florida, with at least a handful of them at the airport. Exactly how they've come to inhabit the airport is not known, but it's thought to have happened recently. One theory has it that the pandemic has kept people inside so much that monkeys have decided to expand their habitat into the formerly busy KFLL airport. Now, of course, they are wild animals and could carry disease, so give them a wide berth and listen carefully to the ATIS for reports of monkey incursions. And finally, from cafinance.yahoo.com, robbers escaped by air after stealing gold bars from a Canadian mine in Mexico. Canadian mining firm Alamos Gold reports that a group of armed robbers intercepted gold bars on the runway at its Molitos mine site in Mexico, then staged a dramatic escape in a separate light aircraft. In a statement, they said that 5 heavily armed people subdued security guards who were loading the bars for transport on a plane on Wednesday morning. At the same time, it says a light plane described as a Cessna 206 landed, and within 10 minutes, the aircraft, the armed group, and the bars were airborne and headed toward the mountains. Alamos spokeswoman Rebecca Thompson says no one was hurt in the dramatic robbery, but added that another mine was robbed a few weeks ago. She says the Molitos loss is covered by insurance. In a report, National Bank analyst Mike Parkin said 2,600 ounces of Dory bars, that's an alloy of gold and silver, were taken, but Thompson could not confirm that figure. And that's the news for this week. Coming up, my weekly updates. And then we'll get to our main topic, which is WAAS instrument approach minimums. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Let's start off with another fun flying destination.
Hi, Max. Jackson from Minnesota for another set of airports worth a visit. Today, I would like to recommend two airports that are about as far north as you can go in Minnesota. The first, just for the experience, is Piney Creek Airport. Airport identifier is 48 Yankee. This airport, along with a tiny handful of others, is in both Canada and the USA. If you're landing on runway 15, your downwind leg will be in Canada, and you will taxi into the United States. Going the other way, you will be back taxiing through Canada. For destinations so far to the north, their gas is surprisingly cheap. From numerous internet posts about the airport, I would recommend that you stop at Rosso Airport, Kilo Romeo Oscar X-ray, and call the U.S. Border Patrol ahead of landing. Apparently, they are suspicious of planes landing here. Their number, 218-463-1952. As I've been told, better a bored and uninterested border guard than an excited and suspicious border guard. After you take off from Piney Creek, you can go to a much more friendly treatment by following the Rainy River east on the south side of the river until you run into the International Falls Airport. Airport identifier Kilo India November Lima. The FBO there is great. They sell canned jams and jellies from Canada. I can highly recommend the Saskatoon jam. Depending on the season, they also sell frozen walleye, so don't forget your cooler. A crew car is available, and I've heard that the area is fun to explore, but when I went, we had to leave to beat the sunset. So there you go, another fun destination in the land north of Toronto.
Jackson, thanks so much for that fun flying destination. And I'd like to ask listeners to tell us about your fun favorite destination, because that was the last recording I have. So guaranteed, if you send me one, yours will be first up. And it's so easy to record these. If you have a smartphone, there's undoubtedly a voice memos app on it. At least that's the name of it on the iPhone. Just go ahead and record it for about 90 seconds, and then you can email that recording to me at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. Or if you'd like, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on listener question at the top, and you can start talking, and the recording will be made automatically for you. So if you know of some hidden gem you'd like to share with everyone else, please record it and send it to me. Now, speaking of recordings, here's a fun one that I was alerted to by a listener. This is the ATIS as of a couple of days ago at Boston's Logan Airport.
Boston area and in the vicinity of Logan Airport. Clearance delivery confined to ground control on 121.9er. Contact 121.9er for clearance or push. Requests. Please be good to each other. We are in this together. Advise on initial contact. You have information, Mike.
And of course, air traffic is at all-time low levels here, not seen since the 1950s, so the controllers have a little bit of time to be creative. I've seen various posts from pilots who've done special trips. One fellow flew his Piper Cub first to JFK, then landed at LaGuardia. And I also talked with someone here in the San Francisco Bay Area who was cleared through the Bravo with own navigation, any altitude. Boy, I have never heard that before. Just so few people in the air. And also one of our patron supporters, Brian Deere, flew into San Francisco, and just for the fun of it, in his Cessna 206. And as he was departing, he asked when he could make his left downwind turn, and they said, at any time, you're the only one in the airspace. So again, these are just amazing, unprecedented times. Here's a PIREP that someone sent to me, and this was filed over Millard, which is in the airport at Omaha, Nebraska. And it was filed, let's see here, time 1701 Zulu, flight level 020, so that would be at 2,000 feet. Type aircraft is Cessna 172, and it says that there's continuous moderate chop at 2,000 feet, and remarks that they'd had low-level wind shear plus and minus 5 knots from the surface to 2,000, and that it was, quote, as turbulent as a beach ball at a Nickelback concert. I, of course, had to look up that reference. Nickelback is a Canadian rock band that was formed in 1995 in Alberta, Canada. So nice to see that people are having a little bit of fun out here during these unusual times. Well, let me mention a couple of other things. I had a text message from my daughter this morning. She runs a department at a local hospital here, which provides treatment. And she said as she entered this morning, quote, the entire police department applauded us as we walked into the hospital today. It was cool. First when I saw all the cop lights outside, I was like, oh, shoot, what's going down? Turned out just to be a parade for everyone leaving night shift and for the arriving morning shift. So that's great. And I talked to her at the end of her day, and she said that it took her about 30 seconds to walk through the full line of officers standing there applauding. So that's a very nice tribute that they did at the Valley Med Hospital in San Jose. And I have a note here from listener Dr. Greg Pinnell. He's an AME, and he passed along a message that was sent to all pilot examiners a few days ago. It came from Penny Giovanetti. She's the Director of Medical Specialties Division within the FAA. Subject, important use of chloroquine/hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19. And the message says use of chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine to prevent coronavirus infection is disqualifying while on the medication and for 48 hours after the last dose before reporting for flight or other safety-related duties. Then goes on to talk about the efficacy of the drug, which is unproven at this point. It concludes, we understand the concern of persons operating in the national and international airspaces, exercising of social distancing and hand washing represent a far more effective means of prevention. As information changes, we will update our policy based on the best scientific evidence available to us. So thanks so much, Dr. Greg. Appreciate that. And here's an email from Daniel Switkin. Now, I taught Daniel his private here at Palo Alto. Oh gosh, probably at least 5 years ago. He says, hope you're well, and thank you for continuing to publish episodes of the Aviation News Talk podcast. I guess we all have a lot of time at home right now. I wanted to do something to help during this pandemic, so I built this website, www.onehobbshour.org, and the number 1 is spelled out, so ONEHobbshour.org. I'm trying to remind fellow pilots how lucky we are and to encourage them to donate. I'd love it if you'd mention the site on the show and in the show links. I also appreciate any feedback you have on how to improve the site, Daniel. And so I went out to the site, and I could see that there are donation links on it for the United Nations Fund and for directrelief.org. But you can also donate to any charity, and after you make a donation, there's a form on Daniel's site that you can fill out so that your donation is counted. I had a separate email from Daniel afterwards that said he's going to match the first $2,000 in donations with his own money. Also on the site are links to Pilots in Pause and Animal Rescue Flights websites. And of course, we'll have a link in the show notes here to Daniel's onehobbshour.org website. So if you'd like to help out, here's a way that you can do that. And I also saw an email that came apparently from a FedEx pilot, though I'm unable to verify it, though it certainly sounds genuine. He said, FedEx still operating close to peak internationally, but we've slowed severely domestically. He said, we've pulled 4 semi-retired FedEx MD-11s out of the desert and sent them to the Pacific, where I've been operating for the past 2.5 months. Every run we're flying there between Honolulu, Sydney, Osaka, Narita, Singapore, Thailand, Hong Kong are maxed out. No one else flying, so all that residual cargo is being directed our way. That being said, every route is nearly empty and every airport is completely full of parked jets. A couple of examples. Flew from Osaka to Beijing during one segment of a trip and saw only 2 additional aircraft airborne the entire flight. During the time we fly that route, one of the busiest in the world, nearly 100 additional aircraft are normally airborne. He said silence on the radio from the controllers. He says we landed in Beijing and we were the only moving aircraft the entire time we taxied in, dropped our cargo, reloaded, and taxied out. He said literally there were 600 plus aircraft parked in every square inch of concrete at the Beijing airport. He said they are now down to 1 runway, as are most airports like it, with all the additional runways being used as parking lots for aircraft. Very eerie to see that. He also said it's incredible to see the lengths that FedEx goes to keep us all healthy and protected through this mess. My hat's off to our dispatchers, ground managers, and everyone on the team who's making it happen safely for us all. And looking ahead to next week, I thought it might be fun to put together a show with a number of very short interviews from people in different parts of the aviation industry telling us about how things are different, what their experience has been. So if you have an experience perhaps similar or even different from the one we've just read here from this FedEx pilot, please shoot me an email at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. Let me know what the situation is where you are, and we may call you up to record you over Skype or Zoom or something like that to put you on the show. But I just thought it would be fun to do a quick survey of different parts of the industry and share with you what people are seeing and experiencing during these very interesting times. And speaking of interesting times, I'd like to thank all of the people who have stayed with me and continue to support the show during these difficult times through Patreon. Now, I mention Patreon every time because we lose a few supporters every time, and we have lost some the last couple of weeks, and I'm guessing some of those people have had their incomes cut back as I have. So I greatly appreciate all the new people who have joined in to step up to support this show. Obviously, this is a free show to you, but it takes a lot of my time, though I also have a lot of fun doing it. But I greatly appreciate your support now because, frankly, this is my major source of income this month, and it's going to cover the mortgage. So I greatly appreciate that. So if you've been thinking, yes, I kind of like this show, and you've been meaning to sign up, well, what's stopping you? It's a really great time to do it. It's only going to take you a couple of minutes. And of course, I read the name of every new supporter on the show. Or if you prefer, I'll read the name of someone else in your family. Plus, we have a lot of goodies for people who sign up for the show through Patreon at various levels. So to support the show via Patreon, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, since you're all awesome listeners, or go to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Now, at either site, you can make a monthly donation via credit card, or if you'd like to make a one-time contribution, you can do that via PayPal. And there are links to both of these sites in the show notes. Just go to the show notes and touch the link, and you won't even have to type in these web addresses. And I'd like to thank all of the new supporters who have joined us in the past week, and they include Ted Pansisin. He edited his pledge up to $50 for 4 months, so thanks so much, Ted. I really appreciate the boost to the income. And we also have people like Dave Eikenberry, who edited his pledge up to $8, Mark Boddy, who edited his up to $20, Chad Carlin, who is new with us, as is Ron Berger, Thomas Qualwasser, he edited his pledge up to $35, which qualifies him for free access to my online courses at pilotlearning.com. Broderick Stadden is new. Vic Bajaj, who I've flown with, edited his pledge up to $20. Paul Mitrakostas, Brian Martin, a new supporter, also at $35 a month. Martin Miller edited his pledge up to $8. And John Amdor edited his pledge up to $5. Thanks so much. We also have a new monthly supporter on PayPal. Thank you so much, Robert Cohen. And we have some one-time donations, thanks to Chris Fenelon, who's down in Australia, Eric Ambrose for a one-time donation of $50. He says he's a healthcare worker, and he thanks me for conveying how serious COVID is on the show. Yeah, thank you for all the things you're doing, Eric. Nicholas Bonacci and Kate donated $30. He says, I hope you will continue with your informative podcast. And I want to thank all of our mega supporters, people who donate $50 a month and more. I mentioned their name on each of our news shows, plus they get one of my $2 after 2 months. They are Brian Deere, who lives here in Northern California and flies at Turbo 206, Tyson Weiss, co-founder of ForeFlight, Victor Vogel, who's a doc in Central PA and thinking about starting a flight school out there, Tim Delaney, he's been flying for nearly 50 years, flies an SR20. Stephen Elop flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ+. He's the CEO of API Jet. Mike Williams, president of Keomac and also TCB Composites, which makes composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft. Seth Lake, we've had him on the show here. He's a DPE, gives check rides, and he specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating. You can find out more about his flight school in Arkansas by going to vsl.aero. Rick Miller, a CFI in the Cincinnati area, teaches out of the Lunken Flight Training Center, as well as with owners of Piper's, Cessnas, Beechcrafts, and Cicadas. He'd love to teach full-time, but still has the day job. Justin Winter, he brokers real estate on Lake Keowee down in South Carolina, flies an SR-22. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation, proud owners and operators of 3 Cessna T240 aircraft. Johnny McDade, singer-songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss, he's just come back from a long break in flying. He's starting to work on his CFI and II, and he'd like to teach full-time on Long Island. Charlie Mason, who flies out of Santa Monica and is getting checked out in the Cirrus. Vincent Salimi, he's council member for the city of Pinole. He's also the owner of Salimi Construction Management in San Francisco. Jim Hopp, known him for a long time. He's a flight instructor, teaches out of Advantage Aviation in Palo Alto, California. Lars Litjens, he's our youngest Patreon supporter. He flies a Redbird simulator, and of course, he's looking someday to being able to reach the pedals in his dad's Cessna 205. Dad, by the way, sells boats in the western states at boulderboats.com. Joseph Sheehan, he flew in the Navy for 8 years and has been flying for the past 3 years on an SR-22 and is looking to take delivery of a Vision Jet soon, so congratulations, Joseph. Josiah Freeman, he's working on his instrument rating. Dylan Caldwell, he's a new AME in Florida at the Naples Municipal Airport, so if you need a physical, either basic med, second or third class, you can connect with him at aviatorsclinic.com. He told me he just had someone come in the other day because even though the FAA has said that They will not enforce medicals expiring between now and June 30th. He said this gentleman's insurance company still requires an unexpired medical. And Ted Pensinson, who I just mentioned earlier on the show, thank you all so much for being mega supporters. Now, in a moment, we're going to be talking about WAAS minimums that you can fly on GPS approaches, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now let's talk about the WAAS minimums that you need to understand to fly a GPS approach with a modern WAAS-capable receiver. Now, we're just going to scratch the surface today, but if you want to know everything there is to know about WAAS-based GPS approaches, you'll want to get a copy of my Max Truscott's GPS and WAAS Instrument Flying Handbook, which you can get for $39.95 by picking up the phone and calling the warehouse where I stock my books at 800-247-6553. And if you choose to do that, I want to thank you very much for your support. Now, first, WAAS stands for Wide Area Augmentation System, and it's a system developed by the FAA to augment the basic GPS system by improving accuracy and integrity. Accuracy is augmented by measuring position errors in the basic GPS signal and sending correction signals to WAAS-capable GPS receivers. To measure GPS error, the FAA has installed GPS receivers at 38 locations, 20 here in the lower 48, 7 in Alaska, 5 in Mexico, 4 in Canada, 1 in Hawaii, and 1 in Puerto Rico. These WAAS reference stations, or WRS, were surveyed so their exact locations are known. The WRSs continually compare their known locations with their GPS computed positions, and any difference between the two, well, that's the total error at that moment for those locations on Earth. Now, it's important to not only measure total error, but to identify the portion of error related to each satellite, such as its clock or position error, and the portion of error introduced by the ionosphere. And that's because correction factors for a particular satellite will be used by all GPS receivers utilizing that satellite. However, ionospheric correction factors used by a WAAS-capable receiver will be based upon the area in which the receiver is located. Thus, ionospheric errors are identified and reported separately from other GPS errors. The 38 WRSs in the US, Canada, and Mexico characterize GPS errors throughout North America. That information must be processed and transmitted so that WAAS-capable receivers can apply correction factors to compute their locations more accurately. To accomplish this, WRSs send their raw position error data to 3 Wide Area Master Stations, or WMSs, which analyze and format the data for transmission. Having multiple WMSs provides redundancy in case a master station fails. And after processing and formatting GPS correction factors, WMSs send their data to Ground Earth Stations, or GESs. The GESs uplink the data to 2 new geosynchronous satellites that transmit it to WAAS-capable receivers on the same frequencies used by GPS satellites. These new satellites also broadcast the same timing and position data sent by GPS satellites, effectively increasing the number of satellites in view. Now, WAAS is the FAA's implementation of what the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, calls a satellite-based augmentation system, or SBAS. Europe and Asia have their own SBAS systems called GAGAN, EGNOS, and MSAS. For simplicity, I'll use the term WAAS, and if you're flying in other parts of the world using a different SBAS system, you'll want to learn how those systems may vary from the WAAS procedures we'll talk about today. Now, let me give you a quick overview of the different types of WAAS minimums, and then we'll talk about each of them in more detail. You can now fly 5 different types of GPS minimums listed on instrument approach charts with a WAAS-capable receiver. In addition, there are 2 other +V variations that are not listed as separate lines on approach charts. We'll briefly mention all 7 and then cover them in more detail. The first is LPV, which is a relatively new minimums type that provides vertical guidance. It allows you to use your GPS receiver to fly an approach in much the same way that you would fly an ILS. It usually provides the lowest minimums available with a GPS receiver. LNAV+V minimums are flown by airliners with special equipment, and you can now fly these approaches with a WAAS receiver. These minimums are usually higher than LPV minimums, since the approaches were designed to be flown with older, less accurate equipment and hence have larger protected areas. LNAV minimums are the ones originally flown with older GPS approach receivers. Pilots have flown these approaches for a number of years, and they are also available with WAAS receivers. They are non-precision approaches and have no vertical guidance. In 2009, a new category of minimums called LP for localizer performance became available. Like a localizer approach, approaches to LP minimums have precise lateral guidance, but no vertical guidance. Many WAAS approaches include circling minimums, and these are similar to circling minimums you'd find for any other approach chart. LNAV+V is a sixth option, though technically it's not a minimums category, and it's not listed on charts in the minimums table. When available, your WAAS receiver provides an advisory glide slope for guidance down to that non-precision set of LNAV minimums. The minimums are the same as for an LNAV approach, but LNAV+V lets you easily set up a stabilized approach at a constant descent rate to reach those minimums. And LP+V is a seventh option. Like LNAV+V, it's not a minimums category and not listed on charts. And it's also easy to confuse LP+V with LPV, as they have the same letters in the same order, but they differ in several ways. Now let's go back and examine each of the minimums in detail. First, LPV minimums. When LPV minimums were first offered, these approaches could go as low as 250 feet above the ground. Now, new LPV approaches have minimums as low as 200 feet, identical to that of a Category 1 ILS. You can think of an LPV as a precision approach, as it has a DA or decision altitude, but legally, an LPV is a near-precision GPS approach that provides localizer performance with vertical guidance, and that's what LPV stands for. As with any approach with a DA, a pilot can descend through the decision altitude as he or she decides whether to land or go around. Most autopilots support DAs by letting you descend right through the minimums you've set with the Alt Select knobs. Note that the autopilot will also descend through any approach with vertical guidance, and that can be a problem on +V approaches, as they have an MDA that you can't descend below unless you decide to land. LPV, when available, is the top line in the minimum section for most RNAV GPS approaches, and it will usually have the lowest minimums for an approach. It is always followed by the letters DA, which stands for decision altitude. And here's a critical point. When you're flying to LPV minimums, you cannot wait until your GPS counts all the way down to 0 miles to identify when to begin flying the missed approach, since it's displaying the distance to the runway threshold and not to where you'll reach the decision altitude. So instead, you need to watch your altimeter and decide to land or initiate the missed approach when you reach that minimum altitude. In many cases, the minimums for an LPV approach are much lower than for a non-precision GPS approach. In order to allow you to descend that much lower, the FAA needed to design smaller protected areas to squeeze the approach in among the many obstacles that exist along an approach. Then, in order to assure that you stay within the protected area, new criteria were developed for the accuracy of a WAAS-capable GPS receiver. On a traditional non-precision approach, a GPS receiver needs a lateral accuracy of 0.3 nautical miles to assure that an aircraft stays in an even larger protected area. Prior to permitting you to fly with LPV minimums, a WAAS receiver is required to calculate its current accuracy, or its HPL, which stands for horizontal position level. This is the maximum distance in meters from your present position to the position where the GPS thinks you are, with a probability of 99 point and then followed by 59%, so almost 100%. To allow an approach, the HPL value must be less than the horizontal alarm limit, which is 40 meters or about 164 feet, which is considerably less than the 0.3 nautical miles or approximately 1,800 feet required on non-precision GPS approaches. It must also calculate the vertical position level, or VPL, which must be less than the vertical alarm limit, or VAL, which is 50 meters to allow an LPV approach with 250-foot minimums and 35 meters to allow an approach with 200-foot minimums. Now let's look at the Cdi sensitivity of an LPV approach. To review, when a basic non-precision GPS approach is flown, plus and minus 1 nautical mile linear scaling is provided until you're 2 miles from the final approach fix, and that's where sensitivity increases to plus and minus 0.3 nautical miles for the final approach segment. The Cdi sensitivity for an LPV approach is also plus and minus 1 nautical mile for the intermediate segment. However, at 2 miles prior to the final approach fix, it starts to change smoothly so that at the FAF, it's either 0.3 nautical miles or 2 degrees, whichever is less. Finally, as you get very close to the runway, the Cdi scaling of an LPV approach will change from angular to linear, so it doesn't become ultra-sensitive as you get closer to the runway, as happens with an ILS signal. The Cdi sensitivity on an LPV approach is set so that the total width is usually 700 feet at the runway threshold, or plus and minus 350 feet for full-scale left or right deflection of the Cdi needle. With a traditional mechanical HSI or OBS with 5 dots to the left and right of center, each dot represents 70 feet. Most glass cockpits, like the G1000, have 2 small circles left and right of center, so each circle represents 175 feet. Now let's take a look at LNAV/VNAV minimums. From a practical standpoint in the US, you'll only use these minimums on the very few approaches with LNAV/VNAV minimums that don't also have LPV minimums, since LNAV/VNAV minimums are almost always higher than LPV minimums. Outside the US, especially in areas with no SBAS systems, there are many approaches with LNAV/VNAV minimums, but no LPV minimums. Like LPV minimums, LNAV/VNAV minimums are specified with a DA, and a pilot can descend through the decision altitude as he or she decides whether to land or go around. A variety of equipment can be used to fly LNAV/VNAV minimums, and most GA aircraft would use a WAAS receiver. But airliners are also certified to fly these approaches, provided they have barometric VNAV systems, also known as baro VNAV systems, which combine an IFR GPS receiver with an additional barometric pressure input. These systems use barometric altitude information to compute a descent path between 2 waypoints or an angle from a single waypoint. There are a number of limitations found in the notes on RNAV GPS instrument charts that apply to baro VNAV systems. However, these notes don't apply when you're flying with a WAAS GPS receiver. For example, you might find notes for high and low outside temperature limits for flying the approach. Also, remote altimeter settings are not permitted for use by airliners with baro VNAV systems, since the farther you are from the altimeter setting source, the greater the possible error when using that altimeter setting. Again, these notes don't apply when you're using a WAAS-capable GPS receiver, and you can use a remote altimeter setting specified on an LNAV/VNAV approach. It's not unusual to see a note that reads WAAS VNAV NA on instrument charts for airports outside of the WAAS coverage area in Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico. In these cases, the airlines win since they can fly to LNAV/VNAV minimums with their baro VNAV equipment, but you cannot if you're using a WAAS-capable GPS receiver. The G1000 and other glass cockpits have a baro VNAV mode, but you're unlikely to see it unless you fly outside the US or outside areas with ASBAS coverage from systems such as WAAS EGNOS and MSAS. Generally, you won't see a WAAS receiver's baro VNAV mode unless the SBAS fails or becomes unavailable prior to the FAF, the aircraft is outside of SBAS coverage, or SBAS is manually disabled on the GPS status page, which, by the way, is one way you can see these indications is if you turn off the SBAS while flying even in a WAAS-capable area. When a WAAS GPS's baro VNAV mode is being used, the glide path indicator appears as a magenta pentagon. If the GPS signal degrades after the final approach fix and the approach is downgraded to LNAV, no GP is displayed on the unit. When flying an LNAV/VNAV approach with a baro VNAV mode and a WAAS-capable GPS, from the FAF to the MAP, the approach must be flown within a plus and minus 75-foot window of the calculated glide path. Now let's talk about LNAV Approaches. LNAV stands for lateral navigation, which is a fancy name for the traditional GPS approaches pilots flew in the past. In the past, when we had just one type of GPS approach charts just listed GPS minimums rather than LNAV minimums. Now we've got multiple types of minimums, and so traditional GPS approach minimums needed a name of their own. And note that if you don't have sufficient satellite signal quality to fly to LPV minimums, your GPS receiver will downgrade your approach to LNAV minimums as indicated by an LNAV enunciation in the HSI. There is no vertical guidance provided for LNAV approaches, hence these are non-precision approaches and the minimums are published as an MDA or minimum descent altitude. These MDAs are treated the same as MDAs for any other non-precision approach, and you are not allowed to descend below them until you're in a position to land. Upon reaching the MDA, you can fly level until reaching the missed approach point, the MAP, where you need to either land or initiate a go-around. For an LNAV approach with no LPV minimums, you can expect the autopilot to level off at the minimums you set with the altitude select knobs. However, if the title of the approach in your flight plan includes LNAV+V, then most autopilots will descend right through the minimums that you've set with the altitude select knobs without leveling off, as we're going to discuss here in a moment. Also, an approach has LPV and LNAV minimums, but for some reason you decide to fly to the higher LNAV minimums while coupled to the glide path, the autopilot's approach mode will descend through the minimums set. In this case, you're going to need to press the Alt key as you reach the MDA to avoid going below minimums. Now let's talk about LNAV+V. Some GPS approaches with LNAV minimums have an advisory glide slope. These LNAV+V approaches use the same LNAV minimums line in a chart's minimums table, but they have an advisory glide path that's flown similar to an ILS, except you're not allowed to descend below its MDA. The purpose of the glide path is to provide a stable descent rate down to the MDA. Now, historically, many instructors have taught students to dive and drive at each step down of a non-precision approach, but the FAA has since determined that the high descent rates used for this contribute to an increase in accidents. Hence, the FAA now recommends that stable descent rates be used on all non-precision approaches, and advisory glide slopes will help pilots determine an appropriate descent rate. Now, you may wonder, why did we ever do dive and drive approaches and why we don't do them anymore? Well, note that dive and drive made sense on NDB approaches where you might have to look from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock to find the airport because they were pretty imprecise. But in a GPS world, the airport is usually right there at 12 o'clock right in front of us, and so pilots no longer need to rush down to minimums to get more time to search for an airport. So if you're an instructor and you're teaching dive and drive, please don't do that anymore. LNAV+V approaches have an MDA. However, the pilot's approach mode treats all glide slopes and glide paths as if they have a DA. So on an LNAV+V approach, the approach mode will descend through the minimum altitude you've set. To level off at minimums as required for an MDA, unless you have the runway in sight and are in a position to land, you'll need to push the autopilot's altitude hold button as you reach the minimums. Alternatively, you can descend using any of the other modes such as VS or FLC or pitch mode, and the autopilot will level off at the minimum altitude. However, if you do that, the autopilot won't be able to track the advisory glide path. Originally, there was no easy way to know ahead of time whether a particular LNAV approach had an advisory glide slope, except to fly the approach and see whether LNAV or LNAV+V is enunciated when the FAF is the active waypoint, and you would see that right in the HSI. Now, when you load an approach, you can these days see LNAV+V listed right next to the approach name when you select the approach in your flight plan, so that's how you'll know if it has an advisory glide slope. Now let's talk about LP minimums. These are used in locations where obstacles or terrain issues preclude LPV minimums. For example, to qualify for LPV minimums, an approach's final approach course must be within 3 degrees of a runway's heading. But a GPS approach with LP minimums can join a runway at an angle to avoid obstacles and terrain while achieving lower minimums than an LNAV approach might be able to. Like localizer approaches, LP approaches have precise lateral guidance but no vertical guidance. Also, like localizer approaches, they have an MDA. Laterally, approaches with LP minimums use the smaller obstacle evaluation area and the 2-degree Cdi sensitivity used for LPV minimums. This sometimes lets designers create approaches with LP minimums that are lower than LNAV minimums. This can occur if obstacles in the larger LNAV obstacle clearance area force a higher MDA. An LP minimums line is published only if vertically guided minimums, such as LPV, are not published for an approach. Currently, FAA policy is to not publish straight-in LP minimums unless an MDA of at least 20 feet lower than the LNAV minimums can be achieved. And now let's talk about LP+V minimums. Some GPS approaches with LP minimums have an advisory glide slope. These LP+V approaches use the same LP minimums line in a chart's minimums table, but they have an advisory glide slope path that's flown similar to an ILS, except that you're not allowed to descend below its MDA. These approaches differ from an LPV in that the final approach course can join the runway at an angle. You may recall that LPV approaches have to be straight in for the final segment. Also, LP+V approaches have an MDA. However, the autopilot's approach mode, as we talked about before, treats all glide slopes and glide paths as if they have a DA. Therefore, if you're descending on the glide path, you're going to have to push the altitude hold button in order to level off at the MDA. Otherwise, the autopilot, when it's coupled to the glide path, is going to descend right through the MDA on an LP+V approach. Well, there you have it. 7 different types of minimums you can fly with a WAAS-capable receiver. Coming up next, some listener feedback right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And here's some feedback from episode 138 on wake turbulence, an email from Patreon supporter Scott Sutton. He provided a link to YouTube, which I'll provide here. He says, at 10:42 into the video, Austin talks about the wake turbulence feature in his Xavion app, and that's spelled Xavion. I went out and looked at it. It is really cool. Essentially, this is an electronic flight bag app, and one of the features it has is that it plots where aircraft have been and where their turbulence behind the aircraft is likely to be several minutes later, so you can avoid the turbulence depicted on the screen. Very, very clever feature. Let's see, here's one from Patreon supporter Troy Wisman. He says via text message here, great episode on NTSB 830 and accident reporting. I'm sharing a contact card I made while studying for the commercial certificate. I hope I never need to use it, but since it requires immediate notification, I figured I'd be less stressed having it easily available. And he sent me that contact card, which is for NTSB 24-hour Response Operations Center with the phone number 844-373-9922. So I added that to the contacts in my phone. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Bill Ayer. He says, Max, good review of wind shear in episode 143. I'd like to add that a forecast for wind shear in a TAF, if not accompanied by a forecast for convective rain showers, is a forecast for non-convective low-level wind shear and, in my experience, produces little to no turbulence. It's very different than convective or microburst wind shear. Here's a link from Scott Denstett's pilotworkshops.com. Thanks for your excellent work and stay healthy. Yes, thanks so much, Bill, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes. Now, here's an interesting thing that came over Twitter. This all started from a tweet from NTSB Newsroom, and that is the official Twitter handle of the NTSB's Media Relations Division. And they first tweeted, NTSB investigating the April 7, 2020 crash of a Schempp-Hirth Standard Cirrus, Groveland, Florida. The NTSB is not traveling to the scene of the crash at this time. Now, I had to look up what that is. That's a glider, a Schempp-Hirth Standard Cirrus. Well, one of our followers here, Dr. Des 1970, replied to both the NTSB and to me via Twitter and said, so if they're not going to the scene, according to your podcast, then there was no serious injury or death, ? And I wasn't sure the answer, but I was guessing it might be different because of the current pandemic. Well, NTSB Newsroom sent a series of tweets giving further explanation. They said, the NTSB is assessing the safety implications for a reported accident and for our personnel who would launch to investigate accidents, incidents, and crashes. We continue our investigative work while exercising established federal and local guidelines for social distancing. The safety of NTSB staff is the chairman's and agency leadership's first concern, and the actions being taken to protect staff reflect their commitment to the health and safety of agency staff, as well as that of their families and the communities in which they live and serve. Historically, about 350 of the 1,200 to 1,300 aviation accidents and serious incidents investigated by the NTSB annually require an NTSB investigator to respond to the accident site to physically examine wreckage evidence, and even more investigations require follow-up travel to conduct examinations and tests of recovered hardware and components. Since implementing social distancing and non-essential travel measures for the NTSB, the need for an investigator to conduct travel associated with examination of wreckage at the scene or in other locations as part of follow-up investigative work will be determined on a case-by-case basis, considering factors such as the circumstances of the accident or incident, volume of information that could be gathered by other sources, and the risk associated with travel in light of coronavirus pandemic. Well, these are certainly interesting times, aren't they? Hey, if you have aviation friends who haven't started listening to the show, please help us out by letting them know, because most new people who find out about the show find out from people like you who tell them. And statistics show that only about half the people in the country even know what a podcast is. So if they're unfamiliar with it, just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, where they can download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS and Android, which is probably the easiest way for someone who's unfamiliar with podcasts to listen to the show. In the App Store, just search for Aviation News Talk, and of course, those apps are totally free. And don't forget to check out our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or our PayPal site at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, and consider supporting the show in that way. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.